The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, but Captain Marcus Delacroix didn't need clear transmission to understand the panic bleeding through his headset. Overwatch, this is Ground Team Alpha. We are pinned down at grid reference 7794 Alpha. Repeat, we are pinned down and taking heavy casualties. The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Rivera, a 20-year veteran who'd never broken protocol by repeating himself unless men were dying. Delacroix pressed his face against the observation window of the forward operating base, watching tracer rounds paint orange streaks across the pre-dawn darkness 3 clicks northeast. What happened next would become the stuff of military legend, though nobody in that command bunker could have predicted it. The rescue mission everyone said was impossible. The pilot nobody took seriously. The ridge that defied physics and common sense alike. But first, there was the map. Delacroix spread the topographical chart across the metal briefing table, his finger tracing the jagged elevation lines that separated Alpha Team from Salvation. Kandahar Ridge rose 800 feet straight up from the valley floor, a granite wall that locals called the Dragon's Spine for good reason. Soviet maps from the 1980s marked it as impassable to vehicles. American intelligence confirmed. No helicopter could navigate the thermals, no ground convoy could traverse the sheer face, no artillery could reach the angles needed for effective suppression fire. "Sir, we've got 18 Marines trapped behind that rock wall," Rivera's voice continued, clearer now as the radio operators adjusted frequency. "Insurgents have high ground on 3 sides. We've got wounded who won't make it through another engagement." Delacroix studied the satellite imagery. The enemy had positioned themselves perfectly, using cave networks and boulder fields to create overlapping fields of fire. Any rescue helicopter approaching from conventional angles would fly into a meat grinder. The terrain channeled aircraft into predictable flight paths, turning rescue birds into clay pigeons. "What about the A-10s?" asked Lieutenant Morrison, the youngest officer in the room. Colonel Henderson snorted. "Warthogs can't thread needles, son. Look at that ridge. You'd need to fly sideways between rock formations with maybe 6 feet of clearance on each wingtip." That's when she walked into the briefing room. First Lieutenant Kazimiera Reaper Kowalski stood 5'4" in combat boots, with Polish cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and eyes the color of winter sky. The other pilots called her the janitor behind her back, claiming she only got the difficult cleanup missions nobody else wanted. What they didn't say, but everyone knew, was that she'd never lost a man on her watch. "I can thread that needle," she said quietly, and the room fell silent. Major Rodriguez looked up from his coffee. "Excuse me, Lieutenant." "Kandahar Ridge, I can get through." "That's suicide," Henderson muttered. "The gap between those rock formations is barely wider than an A-10's wingspan." Kowalski moved to the map, her finger tracing a route that seemed to defy aerodynamics. "Here. The thermal updrafts create a corridor at dawn. Fly inverted through the narrowest section, use the granite face as cover, then roll upright for the attack run." The briefing room erupted in skeptical murmurs. Fly inverted through a mountain pass. The idea bordered on insanity. Even experienced Warthog pilots avoided inverted flight at low altitude, especially in mountainous terrain where one miscalculation meant becoming a crater. "Lieutenant," Delacroix said carefully, "that maneuver has never been attempted in combat conditions." "Sir, 18 Marines are about to become body bags unless someone attempts something new." Henderson slammed his palm on the table. "This isn't some Top Gun fantasy, Kowalski. This is real life, real consequences. You crash into that ridge, and we lose both the aircraft and any chance of saving Alpha Team." Kowalski's expression didn't change. "Colonel, with respect, I've studied that ridge for 3 months. Weather patterns, thermal conditions, wind shear data. I know every rock formation, every updraft, every atmospheric variable that affects flight dynamics through that corridor." "Why?" Morrison asked. Because I knew someone would eventually need to fly it. The room fell quiet again. Outside, the distant sound of automatic weapons fire reminded everyone that time was running short. Alpha Team's radio chatter had grown more desperate, medics calling for immediate evacuation of critical casualties. The approach vector is suicide, Rodriguez repeated. Even if you make it through the pass, you'll be flying directly into concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Not if I use the ridge as a shield, Kowalski replied. Pop up behind the rocks, deliver ordnance, disappear before they can track me. Delacroix studied her face, looking for signs of bravado or fear. He found neither, just cold calculation and something else, an absolute certainty that bordered on supernatural. What makes you think you can pull this off when every other pilot says it's impossible? For the first time, Kowalski smiled. Because everyone else thinks like a pilot, sir. I think like the plane. Dawn was breaking over the Hindu Kush, painting the mountains in shades of copper and gold. In hangars across the forward operating base, maintenance crews ran final checks on various aircraft. Apache gunships too large for the narrow corridors, transport helicopters too vulnerable for the anti-aircraft fire, fighter jets too fast for precision strikes in confined spaces. Only one aircraft seemed suited for what everyone agreed was an impossible mission. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Warthog, the ugly duckling of military aviation. Kowalski performed her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, running her hands along the aircraft's titanium armor plating, checking control surfaces, testing the massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon that formed the plane's spine. The A-10 wasn't beautiful. It looked like something designed by engineers who prioritized function over form. But to Kowalski, it was perfect. Built around a 30mm cannon capable of destroying tanks, armored with titanium bathtub protection for the pilot, designed to absorb tremendous damage and keep flying. If any aircraft could thread the granite needle of Kandahar Ridge, it was this one. "Reaper, you sure about this?" asked Sergeant Davis, her crew chief. "Never more sure of anything, Sergeant. That ridge, it's like flying through a keyhole." "Then it's good I have steady hands." Davis handed her the helmet. "Bring our boys home." Kowalski climbed into the cockpit, feeling the familiar embrace of the ejection seat, the comfortable weight of flight controls in her hands. The A-10's twin engines spun up with a distinctive whine, turbofans generating thrust that would soon carry her through the most dangerous flight path in Afghanistan. She ran through the checklist: fuel, weapons, avionics, emergency procedures, but her mind was already visualizing the approach. "Tower, this is Reaper 17 requesting immediate departure." "Reaper 17, you are cleared for takeoff. Weather shows calm winds through the ridge corridor. Alpha Team reports continuing engagement with enemy forces." "Copy, Tower, Reaper 17 rolling." They accelerated down the runway, lifting off with the ungainly grace of a flying tank. As Kowalski banked toward the mountains, she could see smoke rising from Alpha Team's position, black columns against the brightening sky. Somewhere behind those rocks, 18 Marines were fighting for their lives. "Overwatch, this is Reaper 17, 5 minutes out from target area. Request final position update on friendlies." "Reaper 17, Alpha Team is dug in at the base of the northern face. Enemy positions confirmed on the ridge line at multiple locations. Be advised, anti-aircraft assets are active in your area of operations." Through her headset, Kowalski could hear Alpha Team's radio traffic. Terse calls for ammunition, requests for medical evacuation, the controlled desperation of professional soldiers pushed to their limits. Staff Sergeant Rivera's voice cut through the chatter. "Overwatch, we've got 3 KIA, 5 wounded critical. We need immediate extraction or we're all coming home in boxes." Kowalski banked toward Kandahar Ridge, the massive rock formation growing larger through her canopy. From the air, It looked even more impossible than the satellite photos suggested, a vertical maze of granite spires and narrow canyons that seemed designed to trap aircraft. The morning light revealed details that made her stomach tighten. The gap between rock formations was narrower than expected, barely wide enough for her wingspan. But she'd trained for this moment, studied every angle, memorized every thermal current. As she approached the ridge, Kowalski pulled back on the stick and rolled the A-10 inverted, flying upside down toward the narrow canyon entrance. The world flipped, ground became sky, and suddenly she was threading her aircraft through a corridor of stone with inches to spare on each side. The granite walls flashed past her canopy, close enough to touch. Flying inverted at low altitude took every ounce of skill and nerve she possessed. One slight miscalculation would send her aircraft tumbling into the mountainside. But the thermal updrafts were exactly where she'd predicted, providing lift that helped carry the heavy warthog through the impossible passage. "Holy shit," someone whispered over the radio, watching from the forward operating base. "She's actually doing it." Kowalski rolled upright as she emerged from the canyon, finding herself perfectly positioned behind the enemy defensive line. The insurgents had positioned themselves to repel attacks from conventional approach routes. They weren't expecting an A-10 to materialize from solid rock. "Alpha Team, this is Reaper 17. I have eyes on your position, marking targets now." "Reaper 17, be advised, we are danger close to enemy positions. Some hostile elements are within 50 meters of friendly forces." "Copy, Alpha Team, I see you." Below, Marines waved orange panels to identify their position. Kowalski could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions among the rocks, pinpointing each target with deadly precision. The GAU-8 cannon in her aircraft's nose could fire depleted uranium rounds at nearly 4,000 rounds per minute, enough firepower to neutralize multiple targets simultaneously. "Alpha Team, heads down." The A-10's cannon erupted with its distinctive sound, a metallic roar that struck fear into enemy combatants throughout the Middle East. Depleted uranium rounds chewed through rock formations and enemy positions with equal efficiency, eliminating threats with surgical precision. Kowalski made 3 attack runs, each time disappearing behind the ridge line before anti-aircraft fire could target her position. "Reaper 17, that was incredible," Rivera radioed. "Enemy fire has ceased. We're moving to extract our wounded." "Alpha Team, be advised I'm maintaining overwatch until your extraction is complete." For the next 20 minutes, Kowalski circled the ridge, protecting the Marines as helicopters evacuated casualties and extracted the remaining team members. The mission that everyone said was impossible had been completed without losing a single additional life. "Reaper 17, this is Overwatch. Alpha Team is safely extracted. Return to base." "Copy, Overwatch. Reaper 17 returning to base." As Kowalski flew back toward the forward operating base, she could see smoke still rising from the ridge where enemy positions had been eliminated. The radio chatter told the story. 18 Marines saved, multiple enemy combatants neutralized, 0 friendly casualties. A perfect mission executed under impossible circumstances. But the real impact of what happened at Kandahar Ridge wouldn't be understood until later, when the full story began to spread through military channels. The pilot they called the janitor had just redefined what was possible in close air support operations. "Tower, this is Reaper 17 requesting permission to land." "Reaper 17, you are cleared to land. Welcome home." The A-10 touched down with unusual gentleness, as if the aircraft itself understood the significance of what had just occurred. As Kowalski taxied toward the hangar, she could see crowds of personnel gathering on the tarmac, ground crews, maintenance staff, other pilots, even senior officers who normally stayed in air-conditioned offices. Colonel Henderson was the first to reach her aircraft as she shut down the engines. His face showed a mixture of amazement and grudging respect. "Lieutenant, That was either the most brilliant flying I've ever witnessed or the luckiest. Kowalski climbed down from the cockpit, removing her helmet to reveal hair matted with sweat and eyes that still held the intensity of combat. Luck had nothing to do with it, sir. How did you know you could make that run? Because I understood something everyone else missed. Which was, the ridge isn't an obstacle, it's a tool. Use it correctly and it becomes your greatest advantage. Over the following hours, the story spread throughout the base with the speed of wildfire. The impossible rescue at Kandahar Ridge. The pilot who flew upside down through solid rock. The mission that saved 18 lives against insurmountable odds. But as details emerged, the narrative began to change in ways that revealed uncomfortable truths about perception and respect in military culture. Did you hear about Kowalski? Yeah, crazy lucky break with the thermals. Maintenance crews are saying her aircraft came back without a scratch. How do you thread that needle without touching anything? Probably had help from air traffic control, better radar positioning than we thought. The whispers followed predictable patterns. What had been undeniable skill in the cockpit became luck on the ground. What had been precise calculation became fortunate circumstance. The very impossibility of the mission that made it legendary also made it easier to dismiss as a fluke. But the Marines of Alpha Team told a different story. You should have seen it, Staff Sergeant Rivera explained to anyone who would listen. That A-10 came out of nowhere like it materialized from the rock itself. Perfect positioning, perfect timing, perfect execution. Whoever was flying that bird saved every one of our lives. What was her call sign? Reaper 17, but after today we're calling her the Ghost of Kandahar. The nickname stuck, though its meaning evolved depending on who used it. To the Marines she'd saved, it represented supernatural skill and unwavering dedication. To some of her fellow pilots, it suggested something less tangible, perhaps luck, perhaps exaggeration, perhaps the kind of war story that grew in the telling. 3 days later, Kowalski received orders to report to the briefing room for what she assumed would be a routine debriefing. Instead, she found herself facing a panel of senior officers, including 2 full colonels and a brigadier general she didn't recognize. Lieutenant Kowalski, the general began, we've reviewed the flight data from your mission to Kandahar Ridge. Yes, sir. The maneuvers you performed are not part of any training curriculum we're aware of. No, sir, I developed them independently. Flying inverted through a mountain pass at low altitude represents an extreme deviation from standard operating procedures. Kowalski remained silent, sensing this conversation was heading somewhere unexpected. However, the general continued, the results speak for themselves. 18 lives saved, 0 friendly casualties, enemy positions neutralized with remarkable precision. We're recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Thank you, sir. There's more. We're also recommending you for immediate promotion and assignment to our Experimental Tactics Development Program. Clearly, you understand aspects of close air support that our current doctrine doesn't address. As the meeting concluded, Kowalski realized that recognition brought its own complications. Success at Kandahar Ridge meant leaving the operational squadron where she'd found her place, leaving the crew chiefs who understood her methods, leaving the familiar rhythms of frontline service. But perhaps more importantly, it meant becoming a symbol for capabilities that others might not possess, for approaches that others might not understand, for a kind of flying that existed at the intersection of skill and intuition. That evening, as Kowalski performed her customary post-mission maintenance inspection, Sergeant Davis approached with unusual formality. Lieutenant, word is you're shipping out to some special assignment. Looks that way, Sergeant. Want to tell me how you really did it? The ridge, I mean. Kowalski paused, her hand still moving over the aircraft's control surfaces. You ever notice how this plane sounds different from others? Different how? Most aircraft fight the air. This one talks to it. Davis frowned. I don't follow. The A-10 isn't fast or pretty or high-tech, but it's honest. It tells you exactly what it can do and exactly what it can't. If you listen carefully enough, it also tells you what's possible. And what did it tell you about Kandahar Ridge? That the rocks weren't walls, they were guides. The thermal currents weren't obstacles, they were highways. The whole ridge was designed by nature to channel airflow in specific patterns. I just had to learn the language. The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the base's public address system. All personnel, attention to orders. The following citation is published for information and guidance of all commands. As they read the citation for her Distinguished Flying Cross, Kowalski continued her inspection routine. Awards and recognition felt less important than ensuring her aircraft would be ready for whatever impossible mission came next. But something had changed at Kandahar Ridge, something beyond medals or promotions. The pilot they dismissed as a janitor had proven that impossible was just another word for untried. The question now was whether the military establishment would learn from her example or simply treat it as an unrepeatable anomaly. The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. 2 weeks after Kandahar Ridge, intelligence reports identified a new crisis developing in the Kowalsski Valley. Another Marine unit trapped behind enemy lines, another impossible rescue scenario, another situation that conventional tactics couldn't address. The briefing room filled with familiar faces, Captain Delacroix, Colonel Henderson, Major Rodriguez, but this time they were joined by specialists from higher command levels. The situation is similar to Kandahar, Colonel Henderson explained, but the terrain is even more challenging. General Morrison, newly arrived from Bagram, studied the topographical maps. What about air support? Conventional approaches won't work. The valley is too narrow for standard attack patterns, too deep for effective artillery support, too well defended for helicopter extraction. Where's Lieutenant Kowalsski? She's been reassigned to the experimental tactics program at Nellie's. Get her back here. Sir, with respect, one successful mission doesn't. Colonel, 18 Marines came home alive because that pilot understood something the rest of us missed. I want her back here before we lose another unit to impossible terrain. The call came at 6:30 hours, interrupting Kowalski's morning training routine at Nellie's Air Force Base in Nevada. The voice belonged to General Morrison, though she'd never spoken with him directly. Lieutenant, we need you in Afghanistan immediately. Sir, I'm currently assigned to. Your assignment just changed. There's a transport leaving Nellie's in 3 hours. Be on it. Yes, sir. May I ask what the situation involves? Similar to Kandahar Ridge, but worse. Kowalsski Valley, ever heard of it? Kowalski had heard of it. The Kowalsski Valley was known throughout military circles as the deadliest piece of ground in Afghanistan, a narrow corridor surrounded by peaks that channeled insurgent activity and defeated conventional military tactics. If Kandahar Ridge was difficult, Kowalsski was suicide. How many Marines are trapped? 24. They've been pinned down for 16 hours. Casualties are mounting. The transport flight from Nevada to Afghanistan gave Kowalski 12 hours to study intelligence reports about the Kowalsski Valley situation. The terrain was even more forbidding than Kandahar, a deep canyon surrounded by peaks that created natural firing positions for enemy combatants. Weather patterns were unpredictable, thermal currents were violent, and approach vectors were limited to narrow corridors that funneled aircraft into overlapping fields of anti-aircraft fire. But as she analyzed the topographical data, Kowalski began to see possibilities that others had missed. The very features that made Kowalsski Valley dangerous to conventional aircraft might provide advantages to a pilot willing to think unconventionally. The key was understanding how geography shaped airflow patterns, how mountain faces created thermal columns, how narrow canyons concentrated and channeled wind currents. "This is different from Kandahar," she murmured, tracing flight paths on the satellite imagery. "But not impossible." The pilot sitting across from her, a major she didn't recognize, looked up from his own paperwork. "You're the one who threaded Kandahar Ridge." "Yes." That was either brilliant or insane. "Probably both." "What's your assessment of Korangal?" Kowalski studied the maps again, visualizing airflow patterns and attack vectors. "It's not about the terrain. It's about understanding what the terrain wants you to do." "Come again." "Every landscape has natural patterns: airflow, thermal currents, gravitational effects. Most pilots fight against those patterns, but if you learn to work with them, the landscape becomes your ally instead of your enemy." The major shook his head. "You make it sound mystical." "It's physics, but physics that most people don't bother to learn." Landing at Bagram Air Base felt like returning home after a brief vacation. The familiar sounds of military aircraft, the distinctive smell of jet fuel and high-altitude air, the controlled chaos of a forward operating base during active combat operations. But something had changed in her absence. The way personnel looked at her, the deference in voices when they addressed her, the sense that her presence carried weight beyond her actual rank. Lieutenant Kowalski, a young captain, approached as she disembarked. "General Morrison is waiting in the briefing room." The briefing room contained more senior officers than she'd ever seen in one place: 2 generals, multiple colonels, and a collection of majors who represented various specialties. Maps of Korangal Valley covered every available surface, marked with position indicators, elevation data, and threat assessments. General Morrison stood as she entered. "Lieutenant, thank you for coming. We have a situation." As he explained the Korangal scenario, Kowalski studied the terrain maps with growing understanding. The valley was deeper and narrower than Kandahar Ridge, with more complex airflow patterns and greater concentrations of enemy positions. But the same principles applied. Use the terrain as an ally, understand the physics of mountain flying, find the paths that geography wanted aircraft to follow. "What's your assessment?" Morrison asked when he finished the briefing. "It's doable, but not with conventional approaches." "What would you need?" "Complete autonomy over flight planning, weather data for the last 6 months, and permission to violate several regulations regarding minimum safe distances and approved flight patterns." Colonel Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "Lieutenant, some of those regulations exist to prevent aircraft losses." "Colonel, 24 Marines are about to become aircraft losses if we stick to regulations that don't address this situation." Morrison nodded. "You have everything you requested. When can you launch?" Kowalski checked her watch. "Give me 2 hours to study weather patterns and plan the approach vectors. Then I'll need 1 hour for pre-flight and mission briefing with ground control." 3 hours total. "Yes, sir. But General, I want to be clear about something. This mission is more dangerous than Kandahar Ridge. The margin for error is smaller, the terrain is less forgiving, and the enemy positions are better established. Success is possible, but not guaranteed." "What are the odds?" Kowalski considered the question carefully. 70% chance of mission success, 90% chance of pilot survival, 100% chance that 24 Marines die if we don't try. "Those are the best odds we've heard all day. Go prepare your mission." As the briefing dissolved, General Morrison approached her privately. "Lieutenant, between us, what do you really think about Korangal Valley?" "Honestly, sir, it's the most challenging flying I'll ever attempt, but that's why it might work. The enemy isn't expecting anyone to be crazy enough to try it." 3 hours later, Kowalski sat in the cockpit of an A-10 Thunderbolt, running through pre-flight checks while morning light painted the Hindu Kush Mountains in shades of gold and pink. The aircraft had been specially configured for the mission: extra armor plating, modified fuel load, and upgraded avionics package. Every system had been checked and double-checked by the most experienced maintenance crews on the base. Reaper 17, this is Tower. Weather conditions are marginal but within acceptable parameters. Kowalsski Valley shows calm winds at ground level, moderate thermals at ridge height. Copy Tower. Reaper 17 requesting final clearance. Reaper 17, you are cleared for immediate departure. Alpha 24 is standing by on emergency frequency. Copy, Reaper 17 rolling. The A-10 lifted off into crystalline mountain air, banking toward the dark slash in the landscape that marked Kowalsski Valley. As she climbed toward the operational altitude, Kowalsski could see smoke rising from the Marine's position, evidence of ongoing combat that had lasted through the night. Overwatch, this is Reaper 17, 10 minutes from target area. Request situation update. Reaper 17, Alpha 24 reports continued heavy engagement. Enemy positions are concentrated on both sides of the valley with overlapping fields of fire. Be advised, anti-aircraft assets include shoulder-fired missiles and heavy machine guns. Copy Overwatch, beginning approach now. The entrance to Kowalsski Valley appeared ahead, a narrow gap between towering peaks that seemed designed to trap aircraft. But as Kowalsski descended toward the canyon mouth, she could feel the airflow patterns she'd studied in the meteorological data. Thermal columns rising from the valley floor, crosswinds channeled between rock formations, updrafts and downdrafts that followed predictable patterns based on terrain geometry. Instead of fighting these forces, she used them, banking left to catch a thermal column, rolling right to avoid downdraft, climbing and descending in harmony with natural air currents. The A-10 moved through the valley like water flowing downhill, following paths of least resistance that took her exactly where she needed to go. Alpha 24, this is Reaper 17. I have eyes on your position, marking targets now. Below, she could see Marines huddled behind rock formations, while enemy muzzle flashes sparkled from positions among the cliffs. The tactical situation was even more challenging than intelligence reports had suggested. Enemy forces held commanding positions on both sides of the valley, creating crossfire zones that made movement impossible for ground forces. Reaper 17, be advised we are in extremely close proximity to enemy positions. Some hostile elements are within 25 meters of friendly forces. Copy Alpha 24, I see your markers. The attack run required precision that bordered on the impossible. Flying through the narrow valley at low altitude, avoiding anti-aircraft fire while distinguishing friendly from enemy positions, delivering ordnance with surgical accuracy in confined spaces surrounded by granite walls. One mistake would result in friendly fire casualties or her own aircraft becoming a crater in the mountainside. But as she lined up for the first pass, everything aligned perfectly. The thermals carried her aircraft exactly where it needed to be, the wind currents provided stability for accurate targeting, the terrain features offered concealment between attack runs. For those crucial minutes, pilot, aircraft, and landscape functioned as a single system. The GAU-8 cannon spoke with its distinctive voice, depleted uranium rounds finding their targets with lethal precision. Enemy positions that had seemed impregnable moments before simply ceased to exist, eliminated by firepower delivered from angles that shouldn't have been possible. Reaper 17, that was incredible, the ground controller radioed. Enemy fire from the eastern positions has stopped completely. Copy, beginning second pass on western positions. For the next 15 minutes, Kowalsski systematically eliminated enemy positions throughout Kowalsski Valley, using the terrain features that had trapped the Marines to her advantage. Each attack run followed natural flight paths created by airflow patterns. Each targeting solution utilized geography to provide maximum effectiveness with minimum exposure. When the mission concluded, 24 Marines walked out of Kowalsski Valley alive. Another impossible rescue, another demonstration that conventional wisdom sometimes needed to be discarded in favor of unconventional solutions. But this time, the impact extended far beyond a single successful mission. As news of the Kowalsski Valley rescue spread through military channels, it became clear that something fundamental had changed in how the armed forces thought about close air support operations. The pilot they'd once dismissed was now reshaping tactical doctrine, proving that individual expertise could transcend institutional limitations. General Morrison called it the Kowalsski effect, the realization that exceptional personnel could achieve results that standard procedures couldn't address. Within months, her unconventional methods were being studied at military academies, her flight techniques were being incorporated into pilot training programs, and her approach to terrain analysis was becoming required curriculum for close air support specialists. But perhaps more importantly, the story of Kandahar Ridge and Kowalsski Valley began to change how the military establishment thought about expertise itself. The quiet lieutenant with the impossible solutions became a symbol of hidden potential, of capabilities that might exist throughout the ranks if leaders learned to recognize and nurture them. The pilot they'd called the janitor had cleaned up more than difficult missions. She'd cleaned up assumptions about what was possible when skill, dedication, and courage converged in the right moment. Years later, when military historians wrote about the evolution of close air support doctrine in the early 21st century, they would mark the missions at Kandahar Ridge and Kowalsski Valley as turning points. The moments when one pilot's refusal to accept impossible as an answer changed how an entire military force thought about the relationship between human expertise and technological capability. Lieutenant Kazimiera Reaper Kowalski never sought to become a legend. She simply understood that aircraft and terrain and weather patterns followed natural laws, and that understanding those laws completely enough could make the impossible merely improbable. In the end, that understanding saved more than 40 lives and redefined what it meant to fly in support of those who fight on the ground. The sky, it turned out, had no limits for those who learned its language.